Well, the Republic of Turkey has the 8th largest economy in Europe.
Some say they are the world's new economic powerhouses.
Its strategic location has helped to nearly quadruple GDP.
Worldwide attention to Turkey as a significant emerging market.
We have much to learn from Turkey.
Turkish economy has performed remarkably between 2003 to 2008 period. One of the fastest growing economies of Europe. Turkey was a success story.
Hello, this is Camille Yilmaz from Koç University. I would like to talk about the Turkish experience over the last 20 years. If we want to understand the current economic affairs of the country, it is good to look back at our recent economic past. 1990s and then 2001 crisis, what happened since then. The 1990s is a period of populist economic policies. Public sector finances were used by the political elites to garner more support in the elections. And basically that led to huge public sector deficits. Financed by borrowing in the domestic market, and banking sector also doing a great job for the politicians and the government to bring in the foreign funds and buy the government debt. And basically, in the meantime, banking sector was not regulated. Anyone could own a bank by just putting a $10 million or $20 million in capital. So that led to 1994 crisis first.
Uzunca bir zamandır ülkemizde ekonomik sorunların açılan konu önemli olan Türk insanının refahı. Önemli olan Türk insanının
Things continued afterwards, and in 1990s the banking sector became even more problematic. Government debt became even more problematic, and as a result, in 2001 we experienced our biggest, most critical economic crisis of all. Everyone could expect that the crisis was coming. In a year, Turkish economy shrank more than 5%. Turkish Lira devalued and lost its value by more than 50%. And unemployment increased from 6-7% to 11%. After the crisis took place, Turkey really received significant support from the West in the form of financial funds from the IMF to the amounts of more than $20 billion. However, IMF had serious conditions in terms of policy implementation and macroeconomic institutional reforms. These reforms took to a form of 3 pillars. One pillar is cutting deficits and trying to raise more revenues by the government. The second pillar of the reforms was the central bank independence, so that they can implement their policy without the interference of the politicians. On top of this, we needed another pillar of the reforms, and this was the banking sector regulation. These three pillars of the economic reforms helped Turkey recover from the crisis. Within a year, by the late 2002, Turkey was really on its way to growth again. At the end of 2002, there was new elections. The elections was taken over by a newly formed party that was not tried before, and that is called Justice and Development Party, AKP. AKP get more than 35% of the votes and more than 50% of the parliament, and as a result, they came to power very quickly. So now they had to decide what to do. AKP followed some populist policies early on. However, then they really get in line with the IMF macro and institutional reforms. As a result, under the leadership of Ali Babacan,
Turkish economy has performed remarkably.
So AKP was successful in implemented existing policies, and I would give credit to AKP in that regard. Until 2007, things went very well. Economy from 2000 to 2007 grew by an average of 7.2%. We never had such a long period of growth in modern Turkish history. Growth picked up over time as public sector deficit declined, real interest rates declined tremendously, and that really fed into more investment, not only from Turkey but also from outside. Turkish foreign direct investment receipts increased substantially, in part because AKP followed democratic reforms, and at the end of 2004, EU gave Turkey green light to start the negotiations for eventual membership.
European Union Turkey is the right thing.
And this brought in more than $40 billion in foreign direct investment. And this was all good news. Everything was going fine. But AKP could not see what was coming afterwards.
They are down 110 points up. We're still down 97.
223 and counting right now.
Its economy contracted for the first time in 16 years. October 10th, intraday low. A number of traders watching that. And just an indication on National City being acquired by PNC down 88 cents.
Production by 1.5 million barrels per day, but it wasn't enough to stem the slide.
Right on the opening at the lowest prices for equities.
It's going to do more harm than good.
Due to the uncertainty of equities.
The Dow is down 436 points.
Even though 2009 crisis took place, it shook us a little bit, but our banking sector was in good hands, under good control, so we weathered the storm quite easily. However, afterwards, the leadership of the AKP just started caring about its own future, and that is when the populist policies started to feed in, and political interference in independent institutions like central banks started to come at front. They were independent from the political interference before, but day by day they lost their independence and there were more political interference, and the appointments were not necessarily the right persons, but mostly politically connected individuals. From 2011 elections onwards, the populist policies started to be part of the agenda, and AKP won elections. But each time they use more public funds a little bit, but more often they use the credit expansion. And feeding credit expansion and therefore increasing domestic demand before the elections, especially through the construction sector. The construction sector that used to be around 3.54% of GDP in the 2000s, then went all the way up to around 7% by mid-2010s. 2014, the Prime Minister Erdoğan was elected as the president. 4 years later, in 2018, we switched to a presidential system, and that basically meant that populist policies were unbound with no limits. It can be implemented by decree. There is no control by the parliament. So since 2018, we see appointments of ministers, central bank governors that are not up to the task at all, that are not knowledgeable of what's going on in the country, but they were mostly yes men. And at the moment, we are observing a very populist policy, a populist policy without limits. Since the 1990s to today, there is nothing changed in Turkey. This is gonna increase the burden on Turkish people, that burden of their government, definitely, but it has already increased the inflation burden. Official numbers are 80%, and many economists are not taking the official numbers as seriously. Inflation is definitely above 100% these days. So by the end of the year, we are likely to have a current account deficit above 50 or close to $60 billion. And how are we going to finance this is a very difficult question.